Welcome back to Millennial Z and Boomer X. I am Boomer X.
And I am Millennial Z.
And today we're talking about inflation. How did it get started? How is it impacting you? And what it's really like. So that's going to be our next hour of discussion, roughly an hour. We don't have it scripted out, and everyone's familiar with inflation. It's essentially more money available than we have goods or services to be purchased. So people are willing and able to spend more money in order to get those goods or services they desire. Therefore, the prices of these things go up. That is the most fundamental explanation of inflation you can possibly have. And you'll see all sorts of different, more sophisticated writings on that subject about what it is or isn't, but they all boil down to just what I said. you
Right.
you have people with more money available and fewer goods and services to spend on, so they're driving their prices up and spending more money, either because they have to or they're willing to. There's just so much money available to everybody that prices go up.
Yeah, I guess a different definition is the currency, the value of current currency is not, is greater than or less than product or service, and the inflation service, it's greater than.
Sure, you have economists try to make it
Right.
seem more sophisticated and intricate and
Yeah.
complex by saying, well, actually, the
Yeah.
value of the inherent dollar has dropped, therefore increasing the required expenditure to acquire those goods or services. That's really no. It's still because you have more money, and the people who are actually having to buy this stuff, you have more money to spend on goods or services than you have goods or services available for that money. You can sure, of course, make it more complex. Well, it's the field of economy requires a very considerable thinking. Yeah, whatever. It's still it's still you have a much greater liquidity in the money market than you have goods or services available. And that's either because people have been dumping a ton of money into the system, or there has been a dry up of goods and services available, but there's still roughly the same amount of money. And that means people have more money to spend on those less available goods and services, because what else are they going to spend it on, right? Especially if
Right.
it's required things like food, fuel, energy, things that you have to have, clothing, basic necessities. If you have a little extra money, you'll go ahead and spend it on those things you need because you have to have it. And you'll pay whatever you have to pay if they go up. And the price goes up because they simply need to cut back on the way people are buying these things, and they only have so many available, much like the used car market.
Right.
That's been
Good old
crazy.
supply and demand.
Yeah, the basic, supply and demand thing. And that's really what rules inflation, as much as people try to get a handle on it. And I've seen, and we'll talk about it soon, researched, read, considered, and sifted through hundreds of articles, and they all try to explain away inflation that doesn't necessarily have to line up with an increased supply in the money,
Mm-hmm.
but it always is. And that's why I mentioned about the most fundamental way is more money available than goods or services. And then
Right.
it can happen a number of ways. How we get there could happen in a myriad of ways, but ultimately that's what it is. And hyperinflation is when inflation starts to spiral out of control. The current inflation that we have now in mid to late February 2022, I think is happening. Well, I from the articles, and we'll talk about it shortly. I'll quote those articles. It's finally starting to catch up with us. They dumped a ton of money in the system, and when I say that, I mean tons, quite literally,
Yeah.
into the system over the last year, and had no clue what the real impact would be, and it's gotten out of control for them.
I think you're just taking them for granted, saying they don't have any idea what the impact would be. I think they very well know what the impact's going to be, but it was a band-aid, and now they're suffering the consequences and just want to point fingers afterwards.
Well, the writers of these articles, the journalists, were very careful to try to lay blame on certain things like the pandemic
Hmm.
instead of the pandemic itself didn't cause this. Truly, it was the reaction to the pandemic by
Yeah.
those in positions to do something about it. And one of those things I was talking about, as I mentioned earlier, that the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the consumer price index for all urban consumers was up by 7.5% in the 12-month period ending January 2022, which is the largest 12-month increase since the period ending June 1982. Now, you didn't exist then yet, but I
Yeah.
remember that, and it was terrible. Um, it it cost a lot of jobs, and it created a panic with people, and the jobs that people had didn't pay nearly well enough to cope with the increase of everything because businesses had to go up in their prices to be able to afford to continue to get goods and services. And it was just because of the stagflation trying to be ended by Carter in the 70s and the monetary and fiscal policies that the government had to try to deal with that, which caused a great deal of inflation throughout the 80s, which drove interest rates through the roof, by the way. I mean, you had mortgages in the 80s and 18 to 21%, and that's if you had good credit, which is insane if you think about it, especially today.
Hmm. Yeah. What's the difference between them? Because just the year before that, we had a 7% increase in CPI consumer, index. Um, so
Right, and
what's the difference between then and now?
that was
Because
2020, and for the same reason, they've been dumping money. They being the Federal Reserve has been dumping money into the system, and also the government. So you're really catching it from both ends. The entire economy, the U.S. economy, has been catching it from the Federal Reserve is throwing money out to anybody who wants it, which is everybody, and
Mhm.
the government is also doubling down and sending out tax money in various programs. So all of a sudden, there's a lot of money out there, and due to the manufacturing and industrial shutdowns, transportation, goods and services, due to the pandemic, it exacerbated it because there are no goods and services available because everybody was staying home. So it was, I don't think they realized the impact.
Yeah, two-pronged problem of you
Yes,
have less supply
they
and
went
the
way overboard in trying to keep a depression from occurring because everybody was shutting down and they thought, well, nobody's spending any money, so let's throw a lot of money out there and try to keep everything flowing.
Mhm.
And it backfired,
Yeah.
is what I'm saying. And I'll give some statistics on it. The New York Times reported in October 2021, inflation is likely getting a temporary boost from the $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package that Biden administration ushered in early this year. New Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco research released on Monday suggested the analysis may add fuel to the hot debate in Washington over whether the administration's policies are contributing to the spike in prices. Now, that was October 2021. Biden setting up programs to spend $1.9 trillion for whatever they deem
I
necessary.
genuinely think that's overlooking the, $20 trillion we printed in,
We didn't print it. Federal Reserve printed it.
well,
Government doesn't
I
print
say
their own
we,
money.
yeah, I
Yeah.
say we as in the collective
And it's
America.
important. That's a private concern, and they printed
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Hmm. The Federal
So,
Reserve printed, to be
and
more specific,
when did they print that $20 trillion?
October 2021.
Right. So they're obviously, ready to throw it
That's when
out
they ended.
there.
They started from January 2020 to October
Okay.
2021.
All right. That's what I was talking about. So they started January 2020 and they ended it when?
October 2021.
Yeah, during that period, they printed $20 trillion. So
Yeah.
what did they do with that money? Typically, they shove it out to the other central banks to
Yeah.
try to loan it or move it around or buy bonds with it or whatever they do, but they get it in the system so that people have money available to spend on goods and services.
Yeah. They try to incentivize
Sure.
consumerism as much as possible. Usually that's the
Right,
basic way to
right. To
get
get
money to
to get
flow.
more money in the system. So that was 20 trillion, which they committed in, say, a year and 3/4 out there in the system. All of a sudden, while nobody was able to buy anything or do anything, so there was
Hmm.
no goods and services available.
Yeah, 80% of all US dollars in existence were printed in the last 22 months from that period.
Right. Yeah, it it almost seems like, and these guys that were given advice have all PhDs in economy and finance and fiscal policies. How could they have not known? But the thing is, you see it said,
They
well,
must have known.
yeah, well, one of the articles says, and I won't give the name because it's so atrocious that, it was really the pandemic that created our inflationary problem. No, it wasn't.
It was,
No, it
yeah,
wasn't.
I will give them a bit of the doubt, and they probably mean the policies revolving around the
No, they didn't
pandemic.
say that. That person is a very learned individual, probably has a journalism or English lit degree, and he
Hmm.
wrote the pandemics caused it, not
Right,
what they did during the pandemic, not exactly what caused it,
right.
intentionally not mentioning it, which is
Yeah,
strange to me. Um, I'll show you www.economichelp.org. There was a question asked in March 2020. It said, "Can you print money without causing inflation?" A reader asked, would you please explain to me how we can have no inflation or low inflation if the government injects $2 or $3 trillion in the US economy and output falls?" And the response to this, and this is a person again,
good
was
question. Next person.
yeah, no, this is his answer. He hit this guy, says, "This is an interesting question, but you can print money without causing inflation in some circumstances. In short, the reason is that in a depression, even though the money supply increases, firms and consumers don't go out and spend it. They save it, pay off debts, or use it to meet a fall in income. Therefore, although the money supply is increased, the amount of the money circulating around the economy is still falling." Now,
But we
that
weren't
leads
in
me
a,
to believe that they thought that there would be a depression. And ever since that depression in the United States occurred in the 30s, they are mortally afraid of another one. They think inflation is much better than depression. And I'm here to tell you it is not. We can see other countries and economies all over the world. Once hyperinflation gets started, you can't reel it back in. At
yeah.
least with a depression, you can pump it back up.
Hmm.
But Zimbabwe and even old Germany, which started World War
Most
II,
of South America has this
yeah,
issue.
other countries, they are trying desperately to reel it back in, and you just can't. I don't know why they have this in their minds, but I know people are beginning to have a very difficult time because these policies are, oh, there's no indication of inflation, which I heard on some news broadcasts back in 2020 and 2021. And now they're starting to sound horns and wave flags to show, oh, inflation, it's the worst it's been in 40 years. Well, it has, but it was bad then. But y'all weren't listening to people who actually had to buy food, gas,
Hmm.
repair vehicles, repair homes, and things like that. And now they're talking about it as if it was a surprise. It was guaranteed to happen
Hmm.
due to those incredibly loose and unwise fiscal policies and what they did. I mean, they created 80% of the money in a year and 3/4 that has ever existed in the history of the country. And a year and 3/4 out of 260 years.
Yeah. It's a perpetual problem. It's circular because you have an inflation, which is essentially a tax. So people need more
Right.
money to get things
Well,
done.
it's
So you
based on
raise the
the,
minimum wage, which causes people to have more money
yeah, more
available.
money's available. Yeah,
And then
it's like
it
I'm
just keeps
saying.
going.
Right. And nobody wants to just bite the bullet, which the uh, the person who was in charge of American fiscal policy in the 80s did. That's why he rose those interest rates up so high. which caused a great deal of pain for people in the United States, to 18, 21% on a good mortgage loan.
Get rid of money.
But that's right, to force people to spend more money so that they wouldn't have so much available to spend on other things. And what it did was cool down the economy. But it went on for years. I mean, it was
Yeah.
really tough out there. I mean, you had car loans, cars just stopped moving, but you couldn't get a car loan for under 12%. I mean, it was,
Ooh,
yes. And that's with a significant amount down. If you
and
couldn't put a
especially
significant amount
cars
down, you couldn't
being
get a loan.
yeah, being now with certain trucks being $80,000. Imagine a 12%
Ooh,
loan
yeah.
on eighty
I
thousand
mean,
dollars.
that's
Oof.
definitely, that's far more than I paid for my first house anyway in the
Mhm.
90s. And that is definitely almost double the interest rate I paid. And that's for a vehicle. That's not for
Yeah,
a house. You can't live in
12%
it.
is bad for a personal loan on a luxury motorcycle, let alone on a car you need to get to places.
Right.
That's
Imagine
really
paying 21% on a house, though.
yeah.
That's a true mortgage. It won't be paid off until your death, which is what mortgage means.
Essentially, you just hope it it collapses a bit, or or the economy stabilizes and you can refinance would be my only option at
Yeah,
that
you would
point.
see refinancing go, once it cool, but it may take a decade or more for that to
Mhm.
happen. Until then, you're going to be paying some insane rate. And the first 5 to 10 years, you're just paying off the interest anyway, the way they structure that loan. So you
Yeah.
haven't paid off anything on the house. You're just introducing yourself to new interest rates at that point.
Yeah, a good chunk of the middle class turns into poverty line, under the poverty line from that just alone,
Right.
which is
Now,
insane.
right. Now I looked at the PCI inflation index, or the consumer pricing index, which they, uh,
CPI.
yeah, CPI, my bad. There's another one called PCE,
Hmm.
but I'm talking about the CPI. So that's a more realistic one. It's not the government's version. That is something that also includes food, fuel, um, rent, things that people have to buy on a day-to-day basis, and their prices. Other inflation indexes don't include these things because they say they're too volatile, which to me is a bit silly, because that's exactly what people have to buy, the things you have to buy as a person to live on a day-to-day basis. And
Right.
that's what I'm including.
I'm sure you could look at it in multiple ways and there's always those caveats of inflation being due to, currency value systems comparatively, because say in the EU, when Greece and their relative currency flopped and everybody else's went haywire because of the relative amount of money they had in debt compared to all the other ones, and they are all correlating together. So there's different ways of inflation happening.
Sure. Yeah,
And
like I said, there's a myriad of ways that inflation could actually occur with economies, especially if they're interwoven with other economies and they can be kicked off and various
Mhm.
things. But you don't have to dig very deep, and you can look at the fact that there is all of a sudden a great deal of money being introduced into the system, and now
Yeah.
prices are shooting up, and there's fewer goods and services available due to lowered manufacturing. Now, I will say the lowered manufacturing and the available goods and services are lower because of the pandemic, because people stayed home. They didn't want to
Hmm.
expose themselves and create worse infection rates and things like that. And they were told to stay home by civil authorities.
That
So,
was I would really like to see. Well, of course, we never have that, hindsight 2020. But in this case, we only get to see the aftermath of the policies being affected. I highly
right.
doubt that enough people would have stayed home in this situation to really affect the economy like the policies did.
I don't
I think
know.
other people would have just taken their jobs if they wouldn't have gone. If they're like, well, we still need
Yeah,
people here.
that's a good point.
Hmm.
But like you said, it did happen.
Hmm.
And I think it was a good idea for that to happen, because the mortality rate was probably going to be a little bit worse than the Spanish flu. It was showing up that way. And the Spanish flu was just over 2% in the teens and 20s. due to World War One, it coming over due to World War One and sweeping through the country.
Hmm.
And it was bad. It created ghost towns and shut down factories, manufacturing plants, cities and towns and sectors. And people now don't or didn't do the research to find out how bad that was at a just over 2% mortality rate. And this one seems like it would have been a bit worse than
Hmm.
that. And we have a lot more people than we do now, so it transmitted a lot quicker, and people are far more mobile than they were in the early 20th century. So it was spreading far quicker. So I think it was a necessary thing, which the government called for, as well as the other restrictions. I know people will disagree, but I don't think they were following the actual facts and evidence. They were just knee-jerk reaction. I don't want to be told what to do.
Hmm.
And you and I are both like, neither one of us want to be told what to do. And that's not a bad trait to have, but you still have to have a little bit of critical thinking skills there.
Right.
The government does not want people to stay home. They want people working. That's how they get money. They can't get tax money by people staying home and doing nothing. And I'm
Yeah.
sure that was part of their program, that they wanted to make sure there was money in the system, taxes could keep rolling in, they could keep paying their people and still have their policies and laws enforced and followed on the populace. Because without money, nobody's going to keep working,
Right.
not even federal employees.
Hmm. Yeah. I'd love to talk about, if we ever get the ability to talk about the whole COVID policies and everything that ran around it. But for the most part, I agree that some type of action had to take place because mortality rate, man, that was hard to get out, was was creeping up to dangerous levels. And at the same time, when it first enacted, we just didn't know what it could turn into. So we took the
Right. It could have
precautionary
mutated
tale.
in a really bad way, but it was when it first came out, the mortality rate in the US in Louisiana was around 6%, which
Hmm.
is super high. Now, there are comorbidity factors to which Louisiana has special affinity with, like an overweight population, insulin resistance, uh, vitamin D deficiencies because it's so hot during the summer and stuff. We don't like to go outside. So there were some things like that that paired with it that made it worse.
Hmm.
But that's still super high. That's almost 3 times greater than the Spanish flu, which decimated the United States in the early 20th century. And because of the restrictions put in place, they were able to get it under control. But I know at one point that hospitals were bursting at the seams. People were dying, and it was bad. And
Hmm.
that people just don't understand how bad it because they weren't personally involved. And I've mentioned it before. I've had very close friends of mine die from it that I personally know, not like I heard a story or got this. And a lot of people caught it. A lot more people caught it, but people died who were in otherwise pretty good shape. One was in Olympic caliber shape, died. No comorbidities. You just don't know how it's going to go. It's the genetic lottery. So you had to use a bit of common sense. And again, I didn't want to have to put a mask on wherever I went, but you know what? It was the appropriate thing to do because and they mentioned, well, the mask doesn't stop microbes from going through if it's floating in the air to you. No, you're keeping down your breath going on somebody else. It's they attach to the droplets. It's from for you to keep spreading it to other people, not from you getting it from other people.
Hmm.
To have a mask. Also, wiping things down, staying home, staying away from people. 6-foot barrier and all that. But again, the government's reaction about dumping money into the system, I believe they overreacted and they created this. And I know they were a little bit unnerved by the fact that inflation prior to that was a bit too low. It was under 2%. The Federal Reserve likes inflation to occur at approximately 2% a year. That's been established for decades now that they believe that's a happy economy because this whole economy is based on the Keynesian model anyway.
Hmm.
But so I think they went a bit overboard, dumped far too much money trying to avoid a depression, and have now created an inflationary model that's much greater than they anticipated. And because there are still goods and services that are not coming online. Look how many cars are waiting for semiconductors, waiting to be put out, waiting to be delivered. Now truckers are upset because they don't want to have to get vaccine shots to cross international borders, which, that's another thing we could talk about later. But the thing is, that's slowing down transport of goods and available services based on those goods because they're just not there. But all this money is out there in people's hands waiting. So you can drive prices up because they're willing to pay more.
Yeah, a 14.5% from the both years increase because they compound.
From 2 years.
Yeah, from 7% from one and then another 7.5% to the next one. It's not like,
Yeah, it's more than 14 and a half when you do that because like you said, it's compounding from the last, but let's
Yeah.
just call it for simplicity's sake that it's
Yeah.
14 and a half. It'd be more like 14.5, 496 or something like, but let's say it's 14 and a half.
right. For
So
the simplicity's sake, I think that's going to cause a bubble pop. I think there's going to be a little bit of a collapse somewhere in the economy for America. It's going to have to happen. There has to be a reaction for this. Otherwise, we're just going to keep climbing.
Well, you're going to hit, what you're going to do is hit a hard ceiling because people just aren't going to have money anymore. And all these goods and services that people are trying to catch up are suddenly going to be available. And you're going to have a bunch of broke people with all this stuff around. And there's a depression that they wanted to avoid right there. Because a depression is exactly the opposite of inflationary environment.
Right.
And they're going to have no money in their pockets or not enough money to matter, but all these things available, people are trying to make you buy. And the only way they can do that is by making it cheap. So it doesn't really cost you much when you buy it.
Which goes into, I think, another form of more mom and pop shops closing down because they can't afford to go down to those prices like the big shops can.
Yeah, they still have to pay overhead, which is not going to go down. That's the funny thing. You never see fuel, especially fuel like overhead for offices and buildings, go down much. I mean, sure, they go up or down based on availability and power plants and other things, but it's not much. It's not enough to make an appreciable difference in the decrease in prices. But you do see it shoot up. I saw my electricity bill go up about 25% just in the last few months. No real reason for it. It's just me here. You know that.
Right.
And I don't use much electricity at all.
Right.
My computer uses more probably than anything else I have. And it's gone up 25%. And I don't use it any more than I did before.
Which brings me to my little bit of a conspiracy of, I think they knew what they were doing here. It's another way of getting rid of small businesses and having the bigger businesses become more of
you have to adjust
a prominent
your,
factor.
Tinfoil hat there if you're gonna. Yeah, you really think that? There are other ways to do that because they do.
I don't know if I really think that, but it's
right.
Very
but it's a
convenient.
possibility. It's a possibility, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they do that with legislation all the time. I mean, not too long ago.
With the pandemic policies, they had all these mom and pop shops couldn't have business, but they allowed
right.
Walmart, they allowed Costco, they allowed Amazon, they allowed all these other places to do their typical services. But shady shack down the way couldn't do.
I don't remember that happening where I live. You remember those policies being enacted? Because here it was just stores. They didn't single out the large department or box stores to operate, and they made the small ones close. It was the same. It was, you just had to enact certain policies in order to do so, like the maintaining 6 feet and wearing masks.
It was for several months they didn't allow certain shops to be open because it was too enclosed space for people to be able to.
Oh, the small places.
Because it wasn't enough space for them to be separate. To
be spread out.
Yeah. That's probably how they put that. I'm not quite sure, but I do know people closing shop and going out of business because they weren't allowed to have service.
Yeah,
they weren't allowed to provide service. Restaurants, of course, another one.
That is a bit tinfoil hatty thinking right there. I have to give that to you. I don't necessarily believe that. However, I don't say it's totally insane, just lightly insane. How about that?
Well, the largest amount of money transfer has happened in the last 3 years than ever before.
Well, you said 2.
No, within this pandemic and everything else that's going on with the policies, the largest amount of money transfer from lower
Since
businesses to higher businesses.
2019, right? So that's why you're saying 3, 2019, 20,
Right.
21, 20. Okay.
Since the beginning of the pandemic.
Right. Since the very beginning,
Mm-hmm.
February 2019, thereabouts, something like that in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yes, that's undeniable. They have dumped a ton. That's what we mentioned before, and that's why I use that word ton. I have seen that people in authority know much less than they try to give the impression thereof. And I
Mhm.
think that's what occurred. They made a very bad mistake. And I think, honestly, it's just starting. They're just
Yeah.
unaware of it. Now, if you want to put your tinfoil hat on a little more tightly and add more tinfoil, or perhaps we should say aluminum foil, that hasn't been real tinfoil in many, many decades. You could say the Russian and Ukrainian conflagration that is getting underway right now as we speak could be a part of that because it's raising fuel prices and causing other blockages and panic. But I
Sure.
honestly, I don't see that. I'm not prepared to put on a
I'm
foil
not
hat.
prepared for that one yet, but I do think I'm forced the $80 trillion or the $20 trillion, 80% of all money being produced within the past 2 years is definitely a
Right.
contributing factor for the amount of money transfer, because you have from Amazon going
Well, it has
to
to be. Money has to go somewhere. They have
yeah
to put it in the system or it wouldn't do it. It wouldn't do
yeah
what they wanted it to do. And
Tesla
that's
stocks
really, I
and
think that's
Amazon
really
stocks are
what's causing it. Of
mhm,
course, the lack of goods through the pandemic, but that's being geared back up again. That right now, everybody's playing catch up. Everybody's removing restrictions, putting out goods and services, getting back to work, and it has been for a couple of months.
yeah
So that supply chain is coming back online very, very quickly. And now you have all that money, and these goods are going to start coming out, and people are going to see that opportunity because they're going to need that money because everything's costing so much. But what I'm saying is the inflation is just beginning, and that's what I was getting at. 20 trillion, that is mind-bogglingly large. That is an amount you truly cannot fathom.
it is still not as much as we owe. Can you
Right, and
imagine that?
that's the crazy part.
It's still, and it's close. It's about 2/3, almost. It's a little bit over two
Yeah,
thirds what we owe,
and
but
they
it's still not.
manufactured more of it, and so we're
Yeah.
greater in debt due
Hmm.
to it. And again, $1.9 trillion package program the government's giving out to for assistance and stuff. And I'm not saying that's not needed. I don't know enough about that package to say anything about it intelligently, so I'm not going to.
Hmm.
That just seems like an incredibly large amount of money, and I hope it's well intended and well directed is all
Hmm.
I'm going to say about that. Um, but the inflation in general in the economy is strictly due to the Fed policies. And you could sure place some blame on the pandemic, but I would say all that did was create a different timing. It didn't change. What did they think was going to expect with $20 trillion dropped into the economy in 2 years? To think it wasn't going to cause inflation is truly ridiculous. Nobody could think that that wasn't going to cause inflation. It wasn't a depression, so it wasn't like they were avoiding disaster. I know they thought so because they thought the pandemic may cause it and the shutdown of the economy, but the economy never truly shut down. It
Right.
just changed. It rolled with it and it changed. It slowed down. There was a suspension on many levels, but it never shut down. Governments kept going. I know I kept working from
Hmm.
home. Work was getting done. Documentation was being made. People were being licensed. Other people were being caught for heinous acts, and you know things were being conducted as a government should, although slowly because they
Maybe
had to adjust.
it's a bit of a shortcoming from boomer mindset. They forgot internet is a thing and that we
Well, the
can
people who
work
were
from
in
home.
charge are older. Right. I'm right on the edge of boomer generation and Generation X. So I'm aware. We are the guys who invented the internet, right? The Generation X. But
Sure.
a lot of people simply have no clue of how people could adjust and still make things occur. Regardless, as I mentioned before, if it would have gone into just the beginning of a depression, it's easily to inflate it back up by dumping money. They did it before there was any indication
Yeah.
that there was any sort of depression. That's my thing. And now people are going to suffer. And like I said, it's just beginning. I don't know
Yeah.
where it's going to go. The 7.5% is just a start. The goods and services haven't started arriving yet. And everybody's not back to work. When everybody's back to work and that $1.9 trillion that Biden passed starts being put out, so that's going to be another couple of $1 trillion of money available to people all of a sudden who don't have it. So they're going to spend it like drunken sailors because they're certainly not going to store it away for a rainy day. That's not what those kind of people do. They spend it.
Yeah,
And
most people are under the consumerism culture, so they just immediately
correct,
buy
correct.
things.
So that's how you become aware and eligible for a government program. You need the money, so you need to spend it. And that's my
Right.
point. So they're going to spend it. And what do they think is going to happen? It's just more money on top of more money. While it's inflating, they're adding more air, like faster, faster, more. I don't know what they think is going to occur. I know the 7.5% is the beginning. I promise it's going to be greater. And I know they're talking about increasing the interest rate. So these incredibly low mortgage rates we've been enjoying for the last 10 years, that's going to be history.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the point. Give them an excuse to raise interest rates so people who deal in money can make a lot more money off of interest, because I know banks have been hurting. They haven't been making any money off of interest, and not even really in the bond market. So you're going to see when that goes up, you're going to see the stock market drop severely, because that's going to put a curtail on loans for starting businesses and buying things for business, and loans in the market, because housing prices have gone up tremendously due
Yeah,
to the low
speaking of
interest
the
rates.
stock market, I do think, I don't think, I know this happened with the stimulus checks and everybody being at home for a while because of the pandemic policies, that stocks went crazy. People started investing all over just because they didn't have anything to do, and they started getting into stock market investing.
Right.
Cryptocurrency went insane. People went from
Yes.
20,000 to 60,000 Bitcoin per Bitcoin share. It was insane. And it's kind of starting to finally dwindle down.
Hmm.
I've been
You
watching
see
it
it.
here and there.
Yeah, you see it being withdrawn, especially from cryptocurrency. That was, I think, just a blip on the radar. Like you said, it was people it was a whole bunch of people with a few $1,000s, because that's all we got from the stimulus program. Most people only got a few $1,000s over that 2-year period, which is really
Yeah,
nothing. That's
no,
not going to drive up the price of gas, lodging, car. It's not going to drive up the price of everything in the economy if everybody gets $3,000. I got news for them. If somebody thinks that's true, they have no idea how this works. But it would cause a certain thing, if in the zeitgeist, in everybody's mind, if they want it, it would drive that singular thing's price up. And that, I believe, is an excellent reasoning for why crypto took off. They had a lot of young people with nothing to spend their money on, because they're usually living still with their parents or each other, and they got everything under control, and they're still working because they're doing it remotely, or they figured out other ways to make it work. So they have all of a sudden a few grand. Hey, I've always wanted to buy some Bitcoin or Ethereum. I'm going to dump a couple grand in that and see what happens. And everybody had that same thought and started doing it.
yeah.
I think you're right.
So you get some Ethereum tripling, and same thing with Bitcoin, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
XRP going from 0.02 to 0.64, something crazy.
And it's been dropping.
Yeah,
That's for sure.
I think it's going to keep dropping that like you projected for a while. Um, people
Well,
are
now they need their money, so they're going to be pulling it out
right,
to buy
and
things that they have to have.
and it's not going to get any better anytime soon. So it's just going to keep going down.
Mm-hmm.
People are going to need that money more and more.
Mm-hmm. Without a doubt. And that's gonna, if the hand wringers start seeing that as a depression type thing or a deflationary thing, woe be unto us, because you'll see them start dumping more money and the inflation will get even worse. I'm just hoping
Yeah.
it doesn't cause hyperinflation. We get back to the Wehrmacht, which kicked off World War II. people were actually burning money because it was cheaper to do that than it was to buy logs to burn.
Wow,
Yes.
that's crazy.
Yes, it was cheaper to burn money than logs and coal in Germany during that time.
Yeah, that'll tell you that your economy's not doing well when that's
Yes.
happening.
Mm-hmm. And people forget that. That used to be taught in schools. They probably didn't teach that to you in school because they didn't want you to know that those people were starving to death when they were
Right.
trying to make things happen. Although what they did was atrocious with invasions and other atrocities.
Well, it's a
That,
good way to motivate them to get somebody
yes,
to start doing things.
yes. You when a country is starving, it's willing to do almost anything to make sure it doesn't starve anymore.
Well, if that's the case, then we're definitely making the proper storm for another World War III because if we become the
Well,
inflated, we're the ones who control everybody else's economy. Essentially, we're the biggest consumer.
well, right.
So if we start having issues, everybody's gonna start having
Well,
issues.
that's where I was headed with that. The U.S. is the largest consumer of everything as a single country on the planet.
Hmm.
So if we start having problems, then everybody's going to have problems. And right now, the dollar is still used as the singular monetary instrument to compare against worldwide. And even when we're talking about buying oil and things like that, that may change if inflation gets out of hand. Other countries may look at that and go, why are we still talking about the US? They can't keep their own house in order.
Right.
Why don't we take care of this ourselves? And they come up with their own plan and just leave us out of it.
I don't think us as Americans have enough humbleness to allow that to happen. I think.
Well, it wouldn't be our choice. My point, you know.
I think they would try to make an effort on making that not happen.
Sure, they would fight, kick, and scream because we wouldn't be nearly as important as we are now, but that's a real thing that they need
I
to
don't know if it
consider.
would be a direct retort. I would think it would be an indirect retort, as in, well, I guess we just need to make a war so everybody else has problems too.
It would be a International Monetary Fund decision, IMF, which
Hmm.
has caused countries to rise and fall through their fiscal policies. And if the US doesn't get their house in order, they could certainly say, I think it's better if you're not the mark that everybody attempts to meet
Hmm.
and we go a different way. Because to me, this was an easy error to avoid, and the
Yeah.
reaction was way worse than necessary. Unless, like you said, these guys are all experienced and elderly experts and knew better, and they did it on purpose to drive interest rates up, which is a possibility. Like I
I
say,
just can't. It's such an economic 101 fault. It's such an easy thing to not do. You know what I mean?
I
So many
agree. That
times.
I'm with you. I've said that myself. It's such a thing, but you can be emotionally destroyed in such a way as to not see the obvious, or led with these complex theories that are meaningless, that are
Right.
simply
All these
illusions
if haves
to make
models of.
yourself seem a lot more scholarly than you are.
Mhm.
Simply because you're thinking it, even if you have a high education, doesn't mean it's true. It
You
just
could be
means that
completely wrong.
it just means you're very eloquent in your explanation of something that's entirely wrong.
Right. That
That's all
sounded
that
really
means.
good. Complete BS, but really good. Really
Right?
good.
Yes, that was an unbelievably erudite speech and completely incorrect.
We are all dumber for hearing that.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you,
Uh,
sir.
that's a lot of what I see lately on this, and that was a bit of what I read on this. It's like they took painstaking effort to avoid the obvious of how this occurred, regardless of the figures that were just right there.
Mm.
Right there in front of you what happened. So, well, this is obvious. You can't explain this away as it being anything else because that's the only thing that changed. And here is the result. The only reason it was delayed is because the spending was delayed because nobody could go out and spend the money. They were stuck at home and there was nothing to buy. But now
Yeah.
that the goods and services are coming back and people are starting to go back into society, the inflation has begun, especially in the last year when people started trickling back. And as they come back more and more and the money starts to move around, velocity of money, as they say, you're going to see the inflation go up more. Like I said, this is just the beginning.
Yeah, the only way I could see them thinking this is how it was going to go down and they needed to pump more money was first, they didn't equate in the amount of people that could work from home and still allow the economy to keep pumping,
Yes, they missed
even
on
if it's at
that
a
big time,
crippling
I think.
part.
Right, and
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying. I'm entertaining the foil hat premise, but really,
Mhm.
I think they were simply didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah. The second one being they genuinely were expecting to have to put more rigorous policies, but I think they got too much pushback from just an exorbitant amount of people that they decided to back off from it. So then that didn't go well, even though they already
They
pumped out the
being
money.
they being
The
the
government,
government.
the
Yeah, you got to
government,
say
yeah,
they. There are different theys all around. So you got to be more specific. So you think there was more pushback against government restrictive policies and more people
than they
continue to go to
anticipated.
work and continue to do what they needed to in order to make a living. So the depression or the
Didn't hit
deflationary
as hard.
impact that they projected simply didn't occur.
Hmm.
And so all that money was there, and now it started getting into the system a lot faster and a lot more cleanly than they anticipated.
This is what I can assume safely within
I'd say that's a good
regards.
assumption, and you're at least you're saying it's an assumption, while others say something and declare it as fact.
Right.
It's just opinion. It's your opinion.
Hmm.
It's a good,
I'm
well-educated
not going to
and
say it's one I
well-reasoned opinion.
believe in. It's one I think that could possibly be the reason why they did what they did.
So you're still going with the foil hat thing,
Oh, I'm 100% on the full hat still.
right? And that's because you think.
Not 100%, 80-20.
So you backed off a little bit.
Yeah, 80-20. I think they
Right.
did this all to get more power in their hands.
They don't need much more. They being the ones who
More,
actually
always more.
control the policies. They are making the policies. How much more power can you have? You have all of it already. And that's my point. I think they simply didn't know what they were doing to the degree they thought they did. Their idea was good. It's just they went entirely overboard in the execution. Instead of 20 trillion, it should have been 2. They probably overshot
Wow,
by
you think that
about.
much?
Yes. I think if it would have been 2 trillion, it would have helped the people stay home. They could have paid for people the few grand, the unemployment 600 a month, which to people down here in the Gulf Coast states, that's a lot of money per week for doing nothing.
Yeah.
And time to spend it.
Mhm.
Even if you can't spend it because there's nobody open, you're saving that money.
Mhm.
And they're spending it now, which is why the prices of everything are going up. But that's a lot of money, and that's on top of what the state was giving them. So
Right.
that's a great deal of extra money. And I'm sure that contributed a tiny bit. But all these things stacked on top of each other add up. But that has been withdrawn. But you still have that money now being spent that was available that wasn't before,
Mhm.
prior to them doing that. And now they're going back to work because these places are wanting to open up and they need employees. And employees are quitting, one, because they didn't like where they were and they have new jobs becoming available and they're going to those and they pay more and they need more because prices are going up. At least that's my thoughts about it. But I don't think this was all intentional to drive prices sky high to raise interest rates to make more money, because the ones in charge, were doing just fine. And it wasn't necessary. I think they were just wrong about the depth of the deflationary aspect that they tried to overcome.
Maybe. I never put past the bounds of people wanting more power though.
That's
That's
probably a
like putting a
good,
bounds of stupidity. Never
yeah,
expect
yeah,
less.
that's probably a good thing to keep in mind. And I don't either, but I know at some point when you think there's nothing more for you to overcome, then you just look to exercise your power as opposed to acquire more, because there's no more to acquire,
Hmm.
especially with regard to your own yard. It's yours already. What else do you need to do, right?
Sure.
And that's what I'm saying about it.
Yeah, it's probably the reasonable way about it, but I decline the reason. I want unreasonable.
Yes, that's no, far too rational. I don't like it. No.
And then if I am right by some weird inkling of a chance, then I can rub it in everybody's face.
Yes, you can. You can rub it in mind. It won't offend me. In fact, if you find out, please let me know. I would like to know, and we can hatch more conspiracy theories and see if they're wrong or not.
Yeah,
In
plenty of
fact,
conspiracy theories have been proven right when people thought they were crazy.
right, and that leads me to talk about in our next episode. That's exactly what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about conspiracy theories that turned out to be correct in history. Everybody
Okay.
says, well, that's a conspiracy theory, as if they're dismissing something that's absolutely not true. Well, conspiracy theory only means that a bunch of people, they believe a bunch of people got together to do something. That happens
Hmm.
all the time.
Right.
So, so
Yeah.
it's just a theory that a bunch of people got together or a group got together to do a particular thing. And that's what makes it a theory. They don't know for sure.
Yeah. Conspiracy theory has definitely become a negative connotation and
Oh,
everything
yeah,
involved
sure,
with it.
sure, sure. And for good reason, because most of them are just somebody angry about something and making something up to say.
Sure.
But these things turned out to be absolutely true. And that's what we're going to talk about in our next podcast. But do you
Cool.
have anything else to add for the inflation?
Um, Not really. I I would say that the worst thing about inflation is people don't realize it's a hidden tax, and your investments don't seem to be as great when you're getting when your investment rate, success rate, interest rate is less than the inflation rate. You've essentially lost money, and you didn't even think about it.
Oh, yeah. If you're keeping money in a savings account, you're losing money every day. Things are
Hmm.
costing more and you still have the same amount of money because banks
Oh,
aren't
even
giving
in
any.
investment rates, some people think a 3 to 4% investment rate along of a 50-year period is a really good idea. Well, if you're at a 2 to 5% and you've averaged out where you didn't really make any money.
Right.
So,
You were lucky if you kept your head above water, and you
mm,
probably lost money. You definitely lost money in the last 2 months,
mhm,
without doubt. No matter if your money was in the market or was in a bank account somewhere, you lost money. Now, if your money was in the market in the last year and a half, you made money. The market shot up.
yeah,
I suspect the market is going to be pared down quite a bit when the interest rates are hiked, because there
sell,
won't
sell,
be.
sell, sell, sell.
Yes, people are going to need that money. Exactly right. The
Mhm,
market, I believe, is going to drop considerably in the next 6 months or so, maybe sooner, maybe a little later, but it's inevitable. People need that money, and they've been shoving it in the market because they
yeah,
had nowhere else to put it. So if you have money in there now, either hang tight because it always bounces up, but it may be some years.
right.
And if you need that money within the next several years, you may wish to.
Yeah, if you don't need that money and you're in the red, just hold on. It'll be okay.
Yes, it's going to, like I said, we have a Keynesian economy. Inevitably,
Mhm.
it's going to rise, or it's going to collapse completely, and it won't matter.
Just yeah,
We
it
won't
won't
be
matter
using
anyway.
money anymore. So, but otherwise, just hang on. But if you need
Mhm.
that money in the next several months to several years, I think the sooner you can take it out, the better. And I believe I'm not here to cause a panic. I do not want to cause a panic. I'm just looking at common sense
Mhm.
and how much money do you have and how much money do you need. Everybody has their own personal situation. So if you don't need it, leave it in there.
Right.
You'll be fine. Just hang tight. It's going to be fine. In fact, you're going to make money in 10 years. I have no doubt.
Yeah, more often than not, you holding on, you'll make money.
You're going
So,
to, unless the business collapses, but that's the chance you take with any investment. And that's on
right.
you to make that decision. And I'm just talking in general terms about how the economy is and what inflation is doing. That I can see the market has been dropping. It's been the lowest today as it was all year. And I think it's going to continue to go down. Of course, it's going to go up a bit when people start raking in profits and shorting and things like that. And people are going to buy in when they think the prices have dropped too much. But in general, people are going to need money. And if they've been throwing it in the stock market and they've made some, they're going to have to draw it out to be able to spend money on goods and services they need.
That's yeah, it's a double-sided sword. Everybody's selling. Well, oh, well, these prices are really affordable for me. I'll start buying in some stock, and then everybody else starts
Right,
buying in some stock, and it goes
right,
back
driving
up.
it back
So,
up. And you're going to see that volatility continue. But in general, I think the trend's going to go down until we hit that mark where the economy has stabilized, and it's going to go back to its normal increasing self, because that's
mhm,
just the way our economy works. But it may be a while, is my point.
mhm.
If you need it sooner than later, you may want to take a hard look at it. and decide what to do.
Okay. You got
Thank
anything
you
else?
for listening and watching. I'm Boomer X.
I'm Millennial Z.
We'll see you later. Take care.
Peace.